The West is making a concerted effort to isolate Africa, following a string of coups on the continent. The reason for this is that the West opposes African countries forging closer and more robust ties with non-Western nations. The West is much more alarmed when African nations establish connections with a country that has already faced sanctions and punishment. Iran, an oil-rich nation with nuclear weapons that gives the West nightmares, is one such example. Like North Korea, it has previously been sanctioned and is currently among the most sanctioned nations worldwide. However, now that it is aware that the West is attempting to punish African nations in the same manner that it treated Iran is moving closer to these nations. Therefore, Iran's president traveled to Africa and signed some of the most secret deals in order to create a strong partnership. In contrast to earlier, the West is uneasy about these deals because they fear that nuclear secrets could be transferred to African nations. What has brought Iran and Africa closer together? And what does Africa and the West stand to gain from this strong alliance? Let's watch this video to find out. Iran was the world's most sanctioned nation just prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's interesting to note that although these sanctions were first imposed in 1979, Iran has been effectively expanding and ruling the world for 44 years. That is the reason Iran is so strong. It has been trading and selling oil for the past 40 years, avoiding even the financial restrictions, despite being severely impacted by them. Putin sought Iran to teach Russia how to survive in the face of sanctions, as Russia was severely impacted by them. Because of this, Iran is a genius that knows a great deal about how to deal with the West while still developing well. Now, Iran has become an important ally of Africa as a result of Western sanctions against several African nations. Sanctions have also made it difficult for the people of Niger to have access to enough food, medication, and energy. At that point, Iran must provide some assistance. Iran is now moving closer to Africa rather than the other way around. This is due to Iran's strategic objectives as well. African nations should form their own coalition, as the West is opposing both Iran and Africa. Simply put, two disparate elements can come together to form a more powerful force. Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi began his tour of the continent on July 12, 2023, the first Iranian president to visit Africa since Mahmoud Ahmadinejad 10 years prior. Over the course of 3 days, Raisi and his delegation, which included business executives and Iran's foreign minister, met with the presidents and other high-ranking officials in Zimbabwe, Kenya, and Uganda. The presence of Iranian businesses in the group demonstrated the political and economic ties between Africa and Iran. That might have been something that surprised France. Restoring ties with Africa has been a top priority for Raisi since the beginning of his presidency. His predecessor, Hassan Rouhani, focused on nuclear talks with the United States and other international powers during his first term, separating Iran from the continent. This made it possible for Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, Iran's affluent regional competitors, to engage in regional diplomacy. In 2016, Riyadh broke diplomatic ties with Tehran, and many African nations joined the Saudi-led alliance in Yemen. In light of this, Raisi worked to mend fences and lessen Iran's increasing isolation. When sanctions against Iran were reinstated in 2018, after the United States withdrew from the Iran nuclear agreement, Raisi's expedition to 3 Latin American countries that have experienced U.S. isolation, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, was followed by the tour to Africa. This suggests that Iran is attempting to form a broad coalition of nations that have been severely impacted by the sanctions imposed by the West. Rather than remaining in isolation, these sanctioned nations can band together and engage in commerce, which would not only lift the Western sanctions, but also make them a strong and powerful force opposing the West. It makes sense for Iran to concentrate on Kenya, Uganda, and Zimbabwe. Since before the Iranian Revolution of 1979, Kenya, which is under siege as South Africa, has been Iran's second-largest trading partner in Africa. Kenya imports carpets, chemicals and gasoline, and exports tea to Iran. Iran still has some commercial value even if Zimbabwe and Uganda are comparatively small trading partners. Iranian factories have been producing and assembling tractors in both nations since 2008. Along with South Africa and Sudan, Iran has shipped tractors to Uganda. Iran has also been training Uganda on fisheries developments since 2008. For Iran, ever since Senegal and Uganda gave Iran land to grow oil seeds and other commodities in 2008. Raisi recently traveled to Uganda and visited these fields and farms. You should be aware that Ahmadinejad wanted to build mining and agricultural economic relations with Zimbabwe in 2011. Additionally, Rouhani's administration worked in part with Zimbabwe and Uganda to advance biodiversity, food security, and agricultural output, as well as fighting animal illness, desertification, and drought. Iran has received geopolitical support from Kenya, Uganda, and Zimbabwe. They have served on the boards of governors of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN General Assembly, and the UN Security Council, among other significant multilateral organizations. As a result, they have sometimes been successful in influencing crucial votes, resolutions, and sanctions pertaining to Iran's human rights record and nuclear program. In addition, uranium, the primary resource for Iran's nuclear program, is produced and exported by Zimbabwe and Uganda. Zimbabwe, Kenya, and Uganda have also made an effort to assist Iran in overcoming US sanctions. Ahead of the US pulling out of the nuclear agreement, Rouhani declared in 2017 that he intended to restore banking and financial relations with Uganda. Besides Niger and South Africa, Iran has actively pursued cultural and ideological ties with African countries. Similar to Ahmadinejad, Raisi placed a strong emphasis on anti-imperialism during his tour, especially considering Iran's shared semi-colonial past. Such rhetoric resonated in Zimbabwe, a rogue state struggling with international embargoes and sanctions, where the Islamic Republic had a long-standing relationship with the late President Robert Mugabe. In largely Christian countries like Kenya and Uganda, Iran has also sought religious relations by forming organizations and schools, disseminating publications, educating officials, and even converting some locals to Shiism. Between 1962 and 2018, Iran's commerce with Africa accounted for an average of 2.51% of its total trade. Implies that Raisi's tour will probably influence the game. The reason for this is that Iran has never before approached Africa under such circumstances. For any nation that has been subjected to sanctions or marginalized because of its opposition to the West, the issue now is one of survival. Africa may have diplomatic leeway to develop stronger connections with Iran, while avoiding zero-sum Middle Eastern and sectarian rivalry because to the recent ceasefire negotiations in Yemen and the diplomatic deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which was mediated by China. William Ruto, the president of Kenya, welcomed Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi with open arms, marking the start of a three-nation tour of Africa that Tehran portrays as a new chapter in its relationship with the continent. The Iranian president said that Iran is considering forging far closer connections this time around by referring to Africa as a place of potential. The African voyage of Raisi, which also includes Uganda and Zimbabwe, is the first by an Iranian president in more than 10 years, and is an effort to broaden economic connections in the face of crippling US sanctions. Iran increased diplomatic ties with underdeveloped countries following the US in 2018. President Donald Trump withdrew from the nuclear agreement and reinstated sanctions. Iran's foreign ministry estimates that this year's trade with African countries will surpass $2 billion. Before speaking with Ruto in Kenya, Raisi was given a formal greeting at the presidential palace. The trip to Kenya, East Africa's economic superpower, gives both nations a chance to reevaluate and revitalize their bilateral ties for the benefit of their respective populations. Speaking in Uganda during his infrequent trip to Africa, Raisi vehemently denounced the backing for homosexuality by Western countries, defining it as one of the dirtiest periods in human history. This position is consistent with Uganda's recent anti-gay laws, which have been widely denounced internationally. While in Kenya, Raisi alluded to Africa as a continent of opportunity and a key platform for Iranian products. He emphasized the need to increase trade beyond its existing level, citing Iran's petrochemical know-how and Africa's mineral wealth. Information, communication, and technology, fisheries, animal health and livestock production, and investment developments seem to be the main topics of the memorandums of understanding that Iran and Kenya signed. There were almost 5 openly signed agreements. However, as Raisi stated, it is unknown if they inked deals pertaining to petrochemicals and nuclear energy. Ruto praised Iran as a major global innovation engine and strategic partner. Ruto indicated interest in expanding the spectrum of agricultural exports from Kenya, even if the majority of the country's exports to Iran are tea. Iran also stated plans to build an Iranian automobile manufacturing facility in Mombasa, a port city in Kenya. According to Iran's foreign ministry, Raisi's trip to Africa was intended to advance economic diplomacy, improve political ties with allies, and broaden export markets. Add your voice to the total liberation of Africa by leaving a comment in the comments section below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more informative videos like this one. Let's proceed. Iran's travel to Africa and other diplomatic efforts aim to forge deeper international ties amid a deepening nuclear program conflict with Western countries. Iran's economic problems are made worse by US sanctions, and the US continues to accuse Iran of supporting Russia's drone production in relation to the situation in Ukraine. The United States and Kenya, an East African economic powerhouse and ally, have already participated in strategic civil nuclear cooperation. Uganda has now said that it supports Iran's nuclear program. With the technical assistance of the China National Nuclear Corporation, the nation is attempting to build a nuclear power plant. Zimbabwe, similar to Iran, is sanctioned by the US. Earlier this year, a Zimbabwean ministerial delegation traveled to Tehran and reached agreements to strengthen ties, especially in the petroleum trade. After visiting Kenya, Raisi went to Uganda and then Zimbabwe to talk with President Yoweri Museveni on commerce and bilateral relations. As Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi wrapped up his 3-nation African tour, he signed 12 agreements with Zimbabwe to strengthen their bilateral ties. When the Iranian leader's plane touched down in the capital, Harare, on Thursday, Zimbabwean President Emmerson Mnangagwa welcomed Raisi as his brother on the tarmac. At Robert Mugabe International Airport, hundreds of people, many of whom were members of the Muslim community in the southern African nation, held welcoming banners. Mnangagwa spoke to a crowd gathering around the 2 chiefs of state, who were waving Iranian and Zimbabwean flags. No president would say that about the president of another nation, demonstrating how much deeper the links are than the outside world realizes. The president of Zimbabwe added that Iran was Zimbabwe's ally when the country went to war. Later on in the day, plans to develop a tractor manufacturing plant in Zimbabwe with an Iranian company and a local partner were outlined in the 12 agreements that were signed. Other agreements cover research, science, and technology projects, as well as cooperation in the fields of energy, agriculture, medicines, and telecommunications. Whether Iran and Zimbabwe signed any nuclear deals is still unknown, though. It seems improbable that nuclear negotiations would have been made in an open manner given the restrictions imposed on Iran because of its nuclear program. For this reason, the Iranian president's trip to Africa has caused the West to become increasingly concerned. The West watched his visit with eagerness at every turn. Raisi's African journey is part of Iran's efforts to gain diplomatic support and lessen its worldwide isolation, as both nations are subject to US sanctions. Iran's collaboration with Zimbabwe and the African continent, according to Raisi. This has a lot of promise and might benefit both sides for advancement. Without mentioning the anticipated size of the Iranian investment, Mnangagwa said that Zimbabwe welcomed investments in a number of economic areas. For the West, this is a clear message. In the past, only Western and European businesses would invest in and take use of the natural riches found in African nations. The agreements were usually unjust, granting Western corporations unfettered mining rights in exchange for low taxes. But if a nation like Iran joins, it will not only lead to competition, but also give African nations a chance to determine which pattern works best. Raisi's journey, according to Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Nasser Kanani, is a new turning point that might improve trade and commercial relations with African countries. He pointed out that Tehran and the three African nations had similar political philosophies. However, interacting with Africa involves more than just three nations. Iran has held discussions with two African nations ruled by military juntas, Niger and Burkina Faso. Iran is aware that these African nations will find it difficult to manage the situation following these coups. Iran started negotiations with both nations for this reason. Bakary Sango, the foreign minister of Niger, who was leading a team to the Islamic Republic of Iran, met with Hossein Amir-Abdollahian, the foreign minister of Iran. They discussed the most recent internal events in Niger, as well as a range of other issues of shared concern, such as bilateral and international ties. Amir-Abdollahian underlined the Islamic Republic of Iran's moral position on deepening ties with African nations. He emphasized the importance of strengthening international collaboration in the fields of politics, economics, science, and technology. In order to further the interests of both countries, Amir-Abdollahian further emphasized the significance of high-level delegations visiting each other. Amir-Abdollahian believed that the joint commission between the two nations was an appropriate structure for converting the goals of high-ranking officials into actual economic cooperation. He was hopeful that the Joint Commission's reorganization would result in notable advancements. Sango highlighted the Islamic Republic of Iran's superior skills in a number of scientific, technological, and economic fields. He acknowledged Iran's crucial role in supplying Niger's varied demands in the energy and industrial sectors, and conveyed Niger's desire to deepen ties with Iran in a number of areas. Separately, Ali Bagheri, the deputy Iranian foreign minister for political affairs, visited Ouagadougou for a day and met with Apollinaire Joachim Kilem de Tambela, the prime minister of Burkina Faso. The Iranian first vice president invited Bagheri, who also talked about hopes to strengthen relations between the two nations. The colonialist history of both Africa and the West was discussed, with a focus on the significance of African nations gaining their freedom. The Prime Minister of Burkina Faso acknowledged Iran's important civilization and welcomed the offer, emphasizing the need to strengthen reciprocal connections. A joint Iran-Burkina Faso commission was agreed to be established after Bagheri's meeting with the Foreign Minister of Burkina Faso. The commission's first meeting is soon to be held in Ouagadougou. The possible involvement of Iranian enterprises in the African state was also warmly supported, and talks with the Minister of Commerce and Industrial Development of Burkina Faso centered on expanded bilateral commerce and closer economic collaboration. There would be no immediate benefits to this expanding Iranian-African relations. This is due to the fact that exchanges, including economic collaboration, require time. Accepting that all sanctioned nations should come together was the true and effective aim of these interactions. For this reason, the president of Iran made his first trips to 3 Latin American nations. Those are sanctioned as well. The world will soon witness a close-knit alliance of sanctioned nations thanks to these fruitful meetings. You should be aware that in the past, these kinds of alliances were avoided by African nations. The reason for this is that the world was aware that African presidents were more Western-friendly. However, everyone could see how that worked. In reality, those African leaders were puppets of the West. African nations are now respected as the world watches them make decisions about their future. In a meeting with Olivier Rwanda, the foreign minister of Burkina Faso, in Tehran, Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi commended African countries for their tenacity in the face of colonialism. Currently ruled by the military, Burkina Faso and Mali have cut military ties with France, their former colonial power, in favor of closer ties with Russia. Likewise, Niger has seen massive demonstrations demanding the removal of French troops, the country's former colonial ruler, where a military junta assumed power in July. Raisi praised African nations' resilience against colonialism and terrorism during the meeting, describing it as an indication of alertness and waking. While not expressly mentioning France, his remarks suggested support for the positions taken by these nations. Following two military takeovers in 2022, the ruling junta in Burkina Faso demanded that French troops leave the country. During talks with Rwanda, Raisi stated that Iran is open to sharing its successes and experiences with friendly African nations. Rwanda expressed a wish to strengthen bilateral ties with Iran in return for the interest. This is consistent with Iran's larger initiatives to fortify relations throughout Africa. To mitigate the effects of severe sanctions that have been in place since the US pulled out of the nuclear agreement in 2018. The ECOWAS sanctions now in place in the Western nations have severely impacted Niger. Iran may be a useful ally by providing information on how Niger can continue to develop and utilize its natural riches. Iran has previously done that. It created a market and marketed its oil to other nations in spite of the sanctions. In this way, Russia began to revoke Western sanctions and proceeded to export its oil to China, India, and other countries. In short, Iran has extensive experience expanding and surviving in a sanctioned environment. A number of nations have placed sanctions on Iran, with the United States playing a significant role along with other international organizations. Prior to Russia's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine, Iran had the unfortunate distinction of being the nation with the most sanctions in the world. When the radical students took control of the American embassy in Tehran in November 1979, the United States imposed its first round of sanctions. The US reintroduced them in 1987 in reaction to Iran's actions against the US and other countries in the Persian Gulf, even though they had been temporarily suspended in January 1981 after the hostages were freed. In 1995, these sanctions were extended to businesses connected to the Iranian regime. Iran's failure to comply with the United Nations Security Council's demand that its uranium enrichment program be stopped led to the imposition of the third set of sanctions in December 2006. These restrictions, which at first targeted interests in petrochemicals, oil, and gas, later expanded to include banking, insurance, and shipping, as well as web hosting services. These sanctions have had a significant effect on Iran's economy and people over the years. In international efforts to use sanctions as a tool to influence Iran's policies, particularly with regard to its uranium enrichment program, the US has taken the lead. Iran argues that it is only using nuclear for benign purposes. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which outlined a framework to lift the majority of sanctions in exchange for curbs on Iran's nuclear program, was the result of nuclear negotiations between Iran and Western nations in 2015. UN sanctions were lifted in January 2016, after the final accord was approved in October 2015. But in 2018, the United States pulled out of the JCPOA, reimposing sanctions in November and increasing them in 2019 and 2020, with an emphasis on the banking industry in Iran. Iran was later added to the FATF blacklist on February 24, 2020. Iran may be a strong ally for African nations in addition to teaching them how to avoid sanctions. While having ties with Iran can send a strong message to the West, this connection can also help African nations improve their industry. Should African nations continue to forge relationships with non-Western allies like Iran, Russia, and China? Isn't this a sign of true independence, autonomy, and power that African nations are using? Tell us what you think in the comments section below. We explore the rich history, culture, and the ongoing struggle for sovereignty in Africa. Join us in this important conversation by subscribing to our channel. By subscribing, you're not just staying informed, you're becoming part of a movement dedicated to reclaiming Africa's rightful place on the global stage. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Let's work together to spread knowledge and inspire change. Thanks for watching.